Founders Forum, episode 23.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Founders Forum. Today I'm going to be speaking with David Andolfatto, who received his PhD in economics in 1994 from the University of Western Ontario, London, Canada. He's a native of Vancouver, British Columbia, where he began his academic career. In 2009, he was awarded the Bank of Canada Fellowship Award for his contributions in the theory of money, banking, and monetary policy. In that same year, David left Canada to become vice president and then senior vice president in the research division of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, where he served as a senior policy advisor for James Bullard, CEO and president of the bank. He left the Fed in 2022 to become chair of the Economics Department at the University of Miami Patti and Alan Herbert Business School. So I know David, he's been on my other podcast in the past, and just a very nice guy. And I thought it would be good for our listeners if you heard things from the point of view of somebody who was inside the Fed. And so please be courteous if you disagree with him and comment. He's walking in the lion's den here. He knows that the Federal Reserve is not the most popular institution among some of our listeners. So let's have a civil discussion. And here is my conversation with David Andolfatto. David, welcome to the Founders Forum.
Hey, Bob, it's great to be back.
So I thought, again, just for the listeners here, to be talking with someone who, among other roles, you actually used to work for the Federal Reserve. So can you maybe just give some insight into how did that happen? Was it you saw a job wanted ad, or how does one get to be an economist working for the Fed?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. The way it happened was, I was an academic economist in Canada for about 20 years. And over the course of those 20 years, you meet a lot of people. And I met a lot of people from the Federal Reserve banks in the research divisions. They'd frequently come to our academic conferences. And I got to know, among other academics, like Jim Bullard and Chris Waller. In 2008, Jim Bullard became president of the St. Louis Fed. He promptly hired Chris Waller, who's now a governor of the Federal Reserve System. He hired Chris to lead the research division. And Chris reached out to me to basically be his lieutenant in a quest to rebuild the research division at the St. Louis Fed. So that's how I got to the Fed. It was in 2009, kind of still in the throes of the financial crisis. So it's very exciting. But that's how I got my foot in the door.
Now, I know a lot of people use the St. Louis Fed's database, the online, it's called FRED. Mm-hmm. Is there some reason that's housed like is St. Louis like the data place for the Federal Reserve banks, or is that just a coincidence?
Well, it wasn't really a coincidence. It was actually an outgrowth of an initiative undertaken by former research director Homer Jones, who I believe was either a student of or a teacher of Milton Friedman back in the day. I think way back in the day, Homer was interested in providing some statistics that might aid in the conduct of monetary policy. And what he did was he published 2 or 3 time series of monetary aggregates and distributed them to parties that he thought might be interested. And slowly over time, the number of time series that were being accumulated by the St. Louis Fed grew. And of course, with the advent of the internet, that just kind of snowballed into this vast publicly available data set. So it was not completely an accident. It was kind of an initiative of Homer Jones, one of our past research directors.
And for people who don't know, it's not merely that, you can go there and get in Excel format or CSV all the data. It's that you can chart it, and it's pretty convenient. And so at this point, if I can't find something on FRED and chart it there, it's like I don't even want it because it's too much work.
well, we won't go that far. There's a lot of data sets out there. So this is very good. FRED is very good for macroeconomic time series. There's other, researchers use panel data, kind of more cross-section stuff as well. So, but I think St. Louis Fed is very, very proud of the public service they provide. everybody avails themselves of it. Even Ron Paul avails himself of the St. Louis Fed to depict the basement of the currency over time, for example.
Exactly. So you can see, the purchasing power of the dollar and such. So speaking of which, so I know there's, I think some people have this notion of, oh yeah, the research coming out of the Federal Reserve, it's, all on the party line. But actually, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You tell me. I know you personally, and that you're certainly very friendly to market, the market process, and not having politicians direct resources and things like that. And so, can you give an idea of like the average economist who's working for the Federal Reserve? Are they, I don't know, is interventionist as the typical economist, or less so, or more so? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess, what can I say? There's thousands of economists that work in the Federal Reserve System. I broadly classify them into two groups. You've got the economists working at the Board of Governors, which is a bona fide government institution. It's where Jay Powell, the Board of Governors, reside. Very important decision-making body. And then, of course, you have the 12 regional Feds spread across the country. And each regional Fed also has its own research division that vary in size. The New York Fed is obviously a creature on its own. It's a very large. But there's kind of 11 other regional Feds that, house what I would consider very, very kind of detached and academic type of economists. Indistinguishable, I'd say, from any university department. You'll see some who actually speak quite critically of Fed policy, and others that might not. I think that I don't want to accuse anyone of towing the line, but I mean, I don't know, maybe there's more of, when you're in New York and you're actually there by Wall Street, or if you're at the Board of Governors there in DC, you're in communication and in close proximity to politicians and Wall Street types that you might be just naturally more inclined to see their view of the world, just because of close proximity. But I think that the 11 other regional Feds that are dispersed across the country, as far west as San Francisco, you kind of have that more kind of detached academic feel, kind of a more balanced approach.
So I guess maybe, one way I could ask you or to elaborate on that is there a large degree of autonomy in the sense of people wanting to hire researchers to work on certain areas like that? How does that work? Like you kind of made it sound as if the head of each individual branch is able to largely have a free hand in terms of, let's bring this person on the payroll and have them working on research topics.
Yeah, that's right. The employees at the regional banks, regional Federal Reserve banks, are not government employees, just as you or your listeners may or may not know. Technically, legally, the regional Feds are private corporations. They're incorporated as private corporations. So I personally was never a government employee. I was a private sector employee. The Board of Governors is a bit different. They of course, are considered government employees. So each Federal Reserve regional bank will differ in its kind of outlook on research, whether to have it more in a directed manner or have it more open. The outlook depends on the personality of the president and adopted by the researcher director. At the St. Louis Fed, the view is very much to let the economists decide for themselves which issues were important and worthy to study. So there was relatively little directed research. In part, this is because our president is a PhD economist, and he feels very comfortable that he doesn't need so much assistance. At other Feds, it's you might not have the president might not be an economist. They might be lawyers, whatever. They need a little bit more help and ask for more directed research. So, for example, at the St. Louis Fed, we had people working on housing markets, 20 years ago, when nobody was really talking about them. And then when the financial crisis hit, which was centered in the real estate market in the United States, we had a bunch of economists who had done already decades of work, kind of studying the housing market, and were prepared for that. And our research director credited the fact that at the St. Louis Fed, we let the economists decide for themselves, which are the interesting questions to pursue as academics.
Yeah, and am I getting mixed up with, is it the Dallas Fed I know there was a period where there was a lot of the argument of, I forget the exact terminology, but to say like in the post 2008 period, I know there were some Federal Reserve economists making the case that, well, hey, there was too many resources went into housing, and we kind of just got to sit back and let resources get reallocated and things like that. Because I remember Paul Krugman was mad at them, and he was saying, no, this is crazy. So it was ironic, for people who may be surprised to hear that Paul Krugman was railing against those, do nothing Fed economists kind of thing.
And there's, like I said, there are literally, probably 1,000 or more economists that spread throughout the Federal Reserve System, and you're going to get people with different views, different outlooks, different philosophies. They look at different data. It's just a slice of regular academia, really. Even at the St. Louis Fed, we still had, when I was here, holdovers from the great monetarists from, in the 1960s and 70s, very relatively more kind of free market, non-interventionist type of philosophies. And so those views can coexist. They coexist and they percolate in this kind of constant debate and discussion within the Fed. Outsiders really don't see very much of that, but within the Fed, there's a lot of discussion just every day at the lunchroom table, in seminars that you don't see very much. Most of what people do see are kind of what kind of percolates as the conventional wisdom, where you see the chair, Fed, Jay Powell in this case, will kind of describe what is more or less conventional wisdom, but bubbling underneath is this great constant discussion, I would say, among Fed economists, that not just the ones who want less intervention, but also perhaps ones who want more. So all of this coexists at the same time. It's a very vibrant kind of academic environment in many of these research divisions, I would argue.
So something occurred to me while you were explaining about those data sets. Is there, like now when the Federal Open Market Committee, and they're meeting and they're deliberating about, okay, what's our policy move going to be next, the next announcement we make and so forth. Do they have access to data that like just they see early, or do you get what I'm saying? Like obviously the CIA analyst, like they're looking at stuff that regular people don't have access to. Is the same true of like the inner circle at the Fed, or are they just looking at the same kind of stuff that anybody can look at?
No, I would say that they probably have more in-depth data, kind of broadly defined, not necessarily data in the sense of being numerical stuff. They obviously have the numerical data is basically the same, I would argue. There's other data that is kind of not privy to the public, at least not without a delay. For example, CAMEL ratings for the banks, for example, are disclosed only with a delay for reasons I can get into. But what the advantage, I think, that the FOMC members, the Federal Open Market Committee, the committee of Fed presidents and board of governors who actually decide on monetary policy, the type of data that they would have that the regular person would have is really the anecdotal data that they gather from all of their contacts within the district. So Jim Bullard, for example, we have the St. Louis Fed. We also have regional branches in Louisville, in Little Rock, and in Memphis. And each one of them have board of directors, and us, we'll go down there and sit in on the briefings. And these board of directors, there's like community bankers on there. There's business people on there, and you get this feedback. You get this feedback about local economic conditions that percolate up to Jim Bullard, and then he gets briefed as well. There's a big regional briefing that he gets briefed on. So he's in contact with the CEO of Walmart, for example, which I think the headquarters are in the St. Louis district. So if you have the ear of the president of Walmart, you kind of get data, you get an understanding of what's happening at a major corporation. And then what happens at the FOMC in DC is there's an economic go-around where each FOMC member discusses and reports on the local or district economic conditions. And this is stuff that's not going to show up in FRED, at least not right away. And so this stuff that the FOMC has kind of perhaps a bit of a comparative advantage in the type of data that they have available when they're coming to their monetary policy decision.
Another question that occurred to me as you were going through all that in the procedures is, to the extent that you're comfortable, do you know like how other central banks operate, and is it ever discussed at the Fed, like, oh, the way the ECB does things is blah blah blah, or the Bank of Japan does it a certain way, and maybe we should look at how they do things over there?
Yeah, I mean, my perception of this is, and remember for your listeners, I'm Canadian, a dual citizen now, but I grew up in Canada.
I think we could tell from your accent.
Yeah, okay. But the point of me mentioning that is that being from a small country like Canada, we were very, very cognizant of the U.S. Federal Reserve and policy and the policies of other central banks from major jurisdictions. But when I got to the United States and the Federal Reserve System, traditionally, the Federal Reserve does not really seem to pay too much attention. Foreign central banks, they do. I mean, you can be sure that Jay Powell was talking to his counterparts at other central banks. And then we do have conferences and people do visit. But I would argue that for the most part, the Fed, while it does consider international developments, while it does consider and discuss, say, policy of other central banks, that by and large, the Federal Reserve is really, really concerned more with just domestic issues. And it really does not pay that much attention, I would argue, to the developments or policies of foreign central banks. I mean, in part, this is just because the U.S. dollar is just such it's the king, it's the reserve currency of the world. There's really everything kind of seems to run off the U.S. dollar in any case. So perhaps that focus is appropriate.
Well, I think it's also probably just symptomatic of the United States in general. The people here don't typically, like the world ends at our borders and in their minds. Right. We were joking around before the recording started, folks at home, that the Canadian wildfires, and I was listening to an NPR story, and they were the people were in Washington at the speaking, and they're like, oh yeah, that's I got this cold thing going on or whatever, but other people, it's not just us down here in Washington. Other people are, and I thought they were going to say how the Canadians, of course, have this issue, but no, they were saying, our colleagues up in New York City, and they were listing all these U.S. cities that also were suffering from this smoke that was coming down from Canada, and it was, and apparently, maybe it hurts Canadians too. We don't know. We don't know if they breathe up there. But anyway, but also though, what I meant though, David, was like in terms of the organizational structure, like you mentioned how here the Fed banks themselves are private corporations. And so, I guess I don't know, but like I'm thinking a lot of the other places, they're just literally like arms of the government. And so I'm wondering, well, I don't know. Just things of that nature, just see what I mean. It's not so much just like what's the discount rate over in Japan right now, but in terms of the procedure that they follow over there in order to come up with policy. Is there any major distinctions that you've noticed and thought like there's pros and cons of different ways of doing it?
Yeah, right. I don't know. So, the United States is a bit special. I mean, the Federal Reserve is the third attempt of establishing a central bank in the United States. The first two, the charters were not renewed. So for many, many decades, or was it decades? I can't remember when the second bank charter was not renewed.
I know it was the Jackson administration, but I can't remember the year off the top of my head.
But in 1913, following a sequence of very major financial crises in the late 19th century, culminating with the Panic of 1907, there was a decision that was made that, listen, we can't keep on relying on the J.P. Morgan to kind of coalesce the banking sector and act as lender of last resort. We want to institutionalize this in a manner that, what happens when J.P. Morgan dies, for example. But there was a great, the United States, some consternation over, central concentrations of power. So the Federal Reserve Act actually is kind of it represents a grand compromise. The Fed is actually kind of a very strange creature. It's kind of this public-private kind of hybrid, whereas I mentioned the regional Feds are technically private corporations. They're owned by the banks that are in each district. The shares are non-tradable. They earn a statutory dividend. But the profits of the regional Feds are remitted to the Treasury, and the presidents of the regional Feds, they have quite a high degree of autonomy, though they do have to respect what's going on at the board. And the other banks around the world are kind of more like Canada, for example, and ECB. They're less worried about this private kind of public. I mean, it's more of a public entity in these, whether that ultimately makes a difference in terms of the conduct of these banks, I don't really see it, to be quite honest. They all more or less The ECB, for example, is centered in Frankfurt, and since the emergence of the euro, the former central banks, like in the Bank of Italy, the Bank of France, they are now acting very much like regional Feds, but they are bona fide public institutions. To be honest, I do not see anything that I would say is kind of markedly different in the way that the policy is conducted, in part because I think that the policies are really kind of dictated in terms of what is considered to be best practices according to what's produced in the academic literature, for better or for worse. Not saying that they're good policies, but they're all trying to do more or less what they think is the right thing. And there's I think, a high degree of synchronization across central banks as to what that entails.
Okay, so with the time we have left here, I did want to get on at least two issues. I've looked at some of your writings where I think your view differs from maybe what I would have said on this podcast. So I want to give our listeners sort of alternative frameworks or whatever, just to make sure they can, they have a wide range of opinions to consider. So I know one of them was the yield curve. And so I looked at your work on that. So I'll give you a chance just to go ahead and summarize it. But I'm wondering, well, I'll just go ahead. I think maybe you were focusing on a different aspect of it. I don't know if we necessarily disagree in our projections, but can you just tell us like your thoughts on the inverted yield curve and what that means or doesn't mean as far as an impending recession?
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult to say, and I think most people look at it as just a pure empirical relationship. There seems to be a correlation in the data between inverted yield curves and an impending recession. The yield curve inverted just prior to the COVID pandemic. I mean, so if it's just, it's hard to see how the market anticipated the pandemic and the ensuing recession in that case. So I'm a little bit skeptical on the forecasting ability of an inverted yield curve. I kind of get it. There is a rationale. The rationale basically is that when the yield curve inverts, what's happening typically is that the Fed is kind of caught behind the curve and it's trying to raise the policy rate very aggressively, the way it's doing right now, to try to make up for a past policy mistake. And people are worried, kind of like that the Fed will overdo it in a sense, in the way Paul Volcker arguably did in the early 1980s. And that by overdoing it, you'll induce a recession, and that'll require a future rate cut. That kind of justifies the inversion of the yield curve: high current rates and the expectation of lower cuts owing to a policy mistake and the subsequent recession. For me, inverted yield curves maybe are signaling more growth slowdowns. And barring if there is no central bank mistake, like tightening too hard, that what the flattening or inverted yield curve is signaling is possibly a slowdown in growth. Slowdown in growth is not necessarily a recession. And now, a slower growth, though, means that for any given shock, you're more likely to go into recession. So if you're in a period of a slow growth and say a war breaks out and causes a large spike in energy prices, that might be more likely to induce a recession relative to a case where you're in a high growth phase. But in terms of forecasting recession, I'm a little bit skeptical about that.
So for right now, the yield curve, I think whether you use the 10 or the 2 year, but certainly I've been focused on the 10-year, 3-month one. That's been deeply inverted for months now at this point. So does that, what does that mean? And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but so I've been telling our listeners here on this podcast that if the historical patterns hold up, and I think there's, I have like a theoretical justification why I think the pattern exists in the first place. It's not just this weird scribbles on a piece of paper that make no sense to me, but that either by fourth quarter this year or first quarter next year, I would expect that that's a recession coming. Do you think that won't happen, or you're just saying you couldn't confidently say one way or the other? You don't think we have enough way to know?
No, that's right. The latter. I'm much more agnostic on that matter. I mean, I think that I can see how a recession could be in the cards for all sorts of reasons. First of all, we don't know what the future shocks are going to be. A shock is by definition completely unexpected. Mm-hmm. We could go into recession at any time just because something unexpected happens. But I think in this case, what people are worried about with the inverted yield curve is that the Fed itself is going to induce this recession. And we just saw the recent discussions in Portugal of Jay Powell. And if you hear and read others like Chris Waller, my former boss, they all believe that further rate hikes are down the road because the inflation, while it is coming down, all measures are coming down, but it's still inflation is still above the Fed's 2% target, and so the job is not done in the eyes of these Fed officials. That means a few more hikes. Well, continuing to hike interest rates is going to continue to damage the balance sheets of certain corporations, of banks, and then the question, the fear is that the Fed, in its aggressive pursuit of bringing inflation down, is going to break something in the financial sector in particular. Credit freeze, some sort of where the credit markets just finally just capitulate and break. Then we're going to get your recession. Would I say that's impossible? No, I would not say that's impossible. Am I forecasting it? No, I'm not doing that either. Does the inverted yield curve make me more likely to forecast it? Well, a little bit, just to the extent that the inverted yield curve is showing that the Fed is really hiking aggressively, and people are forecasting a growth slowdown in the future, and that may manifest itself as a recession. Don't know.
Okay, so just to try to paraphrase, are you saying that to the extent that the inverted yield curves historically have contained information about the future, it was basically the people were anticipating that a slowdown was coming, and then given that you thought, okay, so that means, what happens during a slowdown? The Fed cuts rates. So if you're thinking 18 months out in the future, rates are going to be lower than they are now, that would give the yield curve an inverted slope. And then so it's almost like the dispersed knowledge, everyone kind of knows a recession's coming anyway, and then the yield curve is just bubbling that up to the surface.
What I would say is that the yield curve is knowing of a recession is coming is not the same thing as forecasting, because there's confidence intervals around.
Right.
It may or may not. I cross the road, I expect not to get hit, but I might get hit.
Right.
So yeah, I think the inverted yield curve, a plausible interpretation is exactly the one you said. The Fed is hiking aggressively. There is a fear that the Fed may overdo it. It may not, but it may. And if it does, it's going to have to lower interest rates in the future, just according to the policy rule. It has the dual mandate. If unemployment spikes up, it's going to have to cut interest rates to accommodate the subsequent collapse in demand owing to the collapse of the banking, lending, and all that. And this is what people are thinking is very likely. Whether it actually transpires, of course, we can't say for sure. My hope is that it will not. My hope is that the Fed is monitoring. I know that that the people at the FOMC are monitoring these things very closely. My hope is that they don't push it too far. So hopefully those fears do not come to pass.
So if you don't mind, David, let me give the 2-minute version of like the Austrian take on this, and then have you push back, because I gather you're going to disagree. And again, that's folks. That's part of what I wanted David on here is to in case. There's a blind spot in the stuff we've been telling you from this perch that you can see the possible chink in our armor. So, in the Austrian view, it's what happens with boom bust cycles, David, is that during the boom period, the central bank is flooding the market with cheap credit that pushes interest rates down to below like the natural rate, and it causes an unsustainable boom. And there's genuine malinvestments made that too many resources went into housing, let's say, or entrepreneurs collectively start processes, projects that there's not enough real resources to bring to the finish line. Typically, what makes them stop doing that is because price inflation measures start getting uncomfortably high, so they back off, and then there's a crash. And the idea is that crash is inevitable. It's physically impossible to keep the boom going. And so the idea a soft landing, it's not that when the Fed raises rates, oops, they overdid it. It was no, a recession was inevitable. Given that you had the prior boom period, people thought they were wealthier than they really were. That's one way of describing it. And so there is going to be a shock and a realization that, oops, and we got to lay people off and get them into more sustainable enterprises. And so, so that's the standard Austrian story, that it's the boom period where the mistakes are made, and then the bust is kind of like the hangover, to use kind of an analogy sometimes people use. So I'm taking it, you reject that. You're saying, no, there's nothing guaranteeing, it's not that we need to have a recession going forward. That would just be a mistake due to policymakers if we did have a recession. It's not baked into the cake.
Yeah, I'm more sympathetic to the view you just expressed than you might imagine. I would say the following. In fact, the only pushback I would give in the description you gave is not that the logic was incorrect, because I think the logic is pretty solid. But my pushback would be, that is certainly one possibility, and I think recently, in fact, it's kind of a recent, pretty good interpretation of partly what happened with the onset of COVID. But I would argue that there's lots of other things that cause business cycles as well.
Okay.
We had business cycles even before the establishment of central banks or any kind of overt government policies dictating how economies are managed. So we have experience. There's when there are wars, for example, or in smaller economies, weather shocks, hurricanes, and or just outright collapses of confidence. I don't know. But where I actually kind of have some sympathy for the line of reasoning you just expressed. I was familiar with the Austrian line of malinvestment owing to kind of interest rates pushed below the natural rate. Arguably, I'd argue at the onset of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020, I was among those who were arguing, along with Mike Woodford as well, that cutting the policy rate at that time was not the appropriate action. There's a pandemic, the contraction in economic activity that was associated with the pandemic was enlarged. It was very different, say, than the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, where I thought the rate cuts were very important, because in 2008 and 2009, you saw a collapse of the financial system, you saw a collapse in aggregate demand, and it seemed like even in a naturally functioning economy, the equilibrium interest rate would have collapsed in any case, and for the Fed not to accommodate that decline would have exacerbated the recession that occurred at that time. The shutdown, the contraction in economic activity that occurred during the pandemic was largely induced as kind of an investment in public health. We were shutting down leisure and hospitality. If you recall, we were trying to flatten the curve. We're trying
right.
But it was very uncertain about what was this virus? Why was it so deadly? We had no idea about the vaccines that were going to appear later on in the year. And as Mike Woodford wrote, and I kind of agree, what was appropriate at that time was some sort of fiscal action, a redistribution, where we were asking some of our fellow Americans to, sit on the sidelines, stay home from work, because we didn't want to spread the contagion. I mean, whether or not you thought that was a good policy, we were asking Americans to stay at home and not work. I mean, how can you not compensate them? I mean, I was lucky enough to be able to work from home, take some of my money and give it to them to kind of help smooth the shock that was disproportionately felt by Americans associated with the shock. Lowering interest rates at that time does not seem like the right thing to do, because I think it led mainly to kind of what you just described. It clearly contributed to the asset price boom. Home prices, stock market evaluations we saw boomed at a time when we were shutting down parts of the economy to try to deal with this pandemic. But you saw some of that being unwound recently. Now the Fed is tightening, and you saw how, at least initially, the NASDAQ came down, and we've seen some softening in real estate prices. And so I do have some sympathy for this view that, at least in terms of its interest rate policy over the course of the pandemic, the Fed possibly made this type of classic mistake. Do I think kind of that was the worst thing that happened? And there's a question of how would things have do the counterfactual. Imagine that the Fed had followed my advice and kept interest rates elevated where they were. It's not entirely clear to me that the world today would look that much different. I mean, I think you would have had less disruption. You wouldn't have seen as much of a run-up in asset prices. You wouldn't have seen as much of a collapse associated with the Fed tightening. But, to your point, I think this is kind of consistent with this Austrian.
Well, okay. Well, so yeah, that's interesting. Actually, that wasn't on my radar. I didn't realize that you had opposed. And so again, for the people at home, your point is that it's not that if GDP goes down or unemployment goes up, the central bank needs to cut interest rates. It depends on why those are happening. And so one thing is, if there's a financial crisis and people are panicked and withholding spending, then that's one thing that maybe lower rates is the appropriate remedy for. But if spending's dropping off and people are staying home because they're being ordered to by the health authorities, then it's not obvious why flooding the market with more liquidity is the remedy for that.
No, I mean, they again, I mean, I was really discouraging people from calling everything stimulus too. They were talking about stimulus checks. I mean, I kept on, saying as PR, we should actually label this for what it was. It was not meant to stimulate the economy. We were trying to shut the economy down.
Right. Yeah.
So
so more like compensation checks or something like
insurance, where we're, essentially to a first approximation. And it was done, it wasn't, of course, this was done in crisis, this was done. My criticism is that we weren't ready for it, but given that you're in crisis mode, you're basically flooding the households with money. But to a first approximation, it was the bottom half of the income distribution that delivered, that got these checks. I mean, I didn't get any, and I was fine with it. Not happy, of course. I mean, the COVID was a disaster, but to a large extent, these checks that were written were finding their way kind of to the people who needed it. Was it targeted as well as it should have been? No. I mean, was there fraud? Yes. I mean, but you don't want to cut things too finely in a crisis. I mean, I learned this lesson from the financial crisis, where after the authorities came in and supported the financial sector, bailed out in the language of the wording of some people, the American household was largely left to dangle in the foreclosure winds. And that's just a bad look. It's first of all, I don't think it's the right thing to do. And second of all, politically, it engenders kind of this instability. I mean, people get pissed off that, these rich financial types have been bailed out, and why doesn't the regular American? And so if we had to err on one side of the equation, I'd say err on giving too much. What would have been the cost of that? Guess what? It would show up in inflation. But at least you're targeting the people who need the money, and they're not going to, embark in any insurrection and come at you with pitchforks and torches.
Right.
I mean, there was a very real shock that we had to deal with, and somebody has to pay the price. And we had to find some way to distribute the pain in a fair manner. And, just the reality is that you're not going to be able to do that perfectly. But at least I would argue that the United States did a lot better than most other countries.
Okay. We just have a couple minutes left here, like literally 2 minutes. We've got you for here, David. The audience knows my views on inflation and whatnot. So I'm just wondering, can you give your views on, why did price inflation get so high in the U.S.? Did the Fed screw up? And, maybe it's largely what you just said. And then do you expect it to come? Is it under control at this point? Or do you think that, no, they really need to watch that like a hawk? And so whatever your views on that, just to give people an opinion from a former Fed official, economist, what do you think about inflation in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a little bit off of the conventional kind of wisdom here, in that I ascribe inflation. The ultimate inflationary force really comes more from fiscal policy than monetary policy. I kind of see interest rate policy as kind of helping to manage inflation kind of in the short run, but in the long run, it's really fiscal policy, the fiscal deficits that matter. In terms of the recent inflation, like this is my take. It's not that popular, but my take is look. We had this horrible shock, the sequence of shocks. In fact, we also had the energy, the war in Ukraine and Russia, of course, as well. But the pandemic was a terrible shock, a lot of uncertainty. The pain was felt disproportionately. I think most fellow Americans would agree with me that we have to look after ourselves and the most vulnerable, the ones we asked to stay home, leisure and hospitality, usually, mainly low-income workers that are suffering. Some redistribution was necessary. This is not a shock that you could purchase insurance on a private market, at least at any reasonable price. So both from a kind of a moral and economic ground, and also kind of more cynically to maintain political stability, it makes sense to redistribute, say, from people like me who had the benefit of working from home and helping those who were suffering. The way to do that, theoretically, with minimal effect on inflation, is to have a consumption tax or an income tax, like a surtax over the course of the crisis. So I would have seen my income tax go up. You would have seen yours go up a little bit. or perhaps a consumption tax. Perhaps you would have seen the price of goods and services go up temporarily to facilitate this transfer in a non-inflationary way. Everybody would have been complaining about the high surtax, but this is what you have to do. It was a painful shock. Mm-hmm. What they did instead was they did not. The United States does not have a sales tax, so federally mandated sales tax. So what we did was basically print money, and the way that we taxed people like me is and everybody's through the inflation tax. You printed money, you distributed it to the bottom half in not a perfect manner. My cost of living went up. And this is effectively a transfer of purchasing power from me to those who receive the checks. So to a large extent, I think the inflation that we experienced was part of a constrained, efficient redistribution plan, if you want to put it that way. And in part, it was also due to just, of course, the supply disruptions that were associated with the pandemic. Do I think inflation was transitory? I said from the beginning it was going to be transitory. It was a lot higher and more persistent than I expected, but it is coming down. Where is it going to go in the future? Is it going to come back down to 2%? I'm a little bit worried that it might not, because I'm a little bit worried about the future course of the fiscal deficits. So if we want inflation to come back down, I think the fiscal house has to make sure that it gets its house in order for that to happen. Otherwise, I think the Fed is a very, very difficult fight ahead.
Okay, just because our session is going to expire here, so let me stop you there, David. Thank you so much. So, folks, our guest this week has been David Andolfatto. David, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, Bob, it was a lot of fun as always. Thank you.
And everyone, tune in next time. We'll get more views that you can use to help guide you in your business and financial decisions this year.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.